Welcome back. We're talking about the leading role China is now playing for women in business. Let's get back to our panel and let's go to Ray in San Francisco. Ray, I want to get back to something we were talking about earlier on, and that's the changing role of women in Chinese society. The Financial Times reported about 3 months ago on these changes. It cited one report which said that 70% of the 14,000 women who were polled said that they would not give up their careers to have a family and children. How big a change is that for China?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something I've noticed, growing up over there and also living over there as an adult. I would say that's a trend that many people in the media have been talking about, especially in the past year with, more recognition of discrimination and also of changing social patterns. I would say that as Roseann writes very well in her book, that this is relatively new, especially with the economic empowerment of the only daughters of the families who have had all these resources, education, and career opportunities. And together, I think, especially in the past 10 years, especially in technology, there's been so much opportunity for women and men alike to make a huge economic impact that it is definitely affecting, at least I see in my friends in their 30s, it's definitely affecting their choices about whether or not to, quote unquote, give up their career in order to have a family. So they are definitely postponing that relative to, let's say, a decade earlier.
And Peggy, let's look at the one-child policy. Women in business in China have been affected by the country's one-child policy. That policy was eased in 2015. Women can now have 2 children. But there is one report which says that companies are reluctant to hire women because they may have to offer them 2 stints of maternity leave instead of just 1. How big a challenge is that to overcome?
I think it's a real challenge. I know personally that there are companies who don't want to hire women that are of childbearing age, and it's much more, they're not as politically correct here, I should say, in China. So that's definitely an issue. I think that the one-child policy, even as it's relaxed, I see that a lot of people choose not to have more than 1 child just because it's so expensive. It's getting more and more expensive. The costs that I mentioned earlier about childcare have skyrocketed here in Shanghai. So even though you can hire caretakers, it's much more expensive. So you might see a few 2-child families, but it's really not a huge trend, as big of a trend that the government was expecting, I would say.
Julie, of course, that's one challenge that women would face in the marketplace, but there are also still chauvinistic attitudes in China. There was one businessman who recently caused an outcry. That businessman, Liu Mingxiong, described women in the workplace in negative terms, saying that it was like having someone dishonest and someone with an inability to learn in the workplace. Is that widespread, and how does one overcome that?
I don't think that extreme form of chauvinism is very widespread, but there are some more subtle forms of chauvinism that exist here. It's very common to hear people in the business world say that women are better at detailed type of work, and men are better at strategy. And the assumption that underlies a statement like that is that men are better at being leaders because they're better at strategy. And this is just sort of a cultural assumption that people make, and there's no data to back it up. But it's there as sort of a prevalent attitude that does play against women in terms of their perceived legitimacy to be leaders and to move up in the business world.
Roseann, what about the representation of women in politics in China, where they may have more say on policies that affect them? That figure is small. At the recent 19th Party Congress, only 10 of the delegates were women.
Yes. At the highest levels of leadership in China, from a political perspective, it really is a sea of black suits. That's what you get. And it is a jarring comparison to sort of what you see in the private sector, because I think, many women will agree that, many women visiting China, I have friends who have visited, they're consistently impressed with, female CEOs in China and female business leaders, which, are not in shortage. But from a political perspective, they are not in the highest echelons of government. It's funny you asked this. I was discussing with Julie about this earlier, and she was mentioning, maybe I'll let Julie jump in, but, just kind of in summary, from a parliamentary perspective, which tends to be the measure of how how women are represented from a political perspective, China is just above the norm. So it's not it's not terrible, but certainly it is a very dark sea of black suits, and I don't think that necessarily represents what's going on in the business world and from an economic perspective. But it is somewhat alarming that politically it is still very male dominated. Alarming, but also not entirely surprising. That's kind of the contradiction that you get here, China being a land of many, many contradictions.
Okay, well, let's get Julie to jump in. Julie, what do you make of the fact that there is such a low representation of women in the highest levels of politics in China?
That's a difficult question to answer. It's frankly surprising, given that the equality of women and men was a founding principle of the People's Republic of China. And we can see in some other countries in the world with strong communist traditions, and Cuba is one of those, we see much higher levels of women in government leadership than we do in China. I think there's a lot of cultural factors at play here, a lot of assumptions, like I said earlier, about who's fit to be a leader and who's not fit to be a leader. But I agree with Roseann that it's easier for women to get into positions of leadership in the private sector. I think there's a little more space there, a little more leniency for really talented people to rise up, and there's a bit less in the government. And the higher you go in the government, the fewer women that you see.
Nanda, I might jump in with a theory here.
Go ahead.
So one of the things that I've been doing since 2008 is training mayors how to build cities here in China. I've taught maybe 1,000 mayors and central government business officials and, government officials. And one of the things that I learned was that drinking is a huge part of politics. And so I've had dinners where there are 100 mayors in the room, and I've seen this little short mayor who's a woman come around with a bottle just toasting everybody. And she came up to me later saying, if you really want to do business with these mayors, you have to toast not each table, but you have to toast each mayor. And so you can imagine that as a female, to have that pressure to drink, it's quite hard. Now, what's wonderful about the Xi Jinping administration is that since 2012, there's been a huge clamp on corruption and drinking and food waste at banquets. And so that amount of drinking has really gone down or disappeared at many of the events that I go to. And so I think, my suspicion is that within a generation, you'll actually see more women in politics because of this one thing.
And Peggy, let me ask you this. China is a changing society, and it's a society that's changing very, very fast. And when we look at these changes that we see among women, how has that affected change in China, the fact that more and more women are getting involved in business?
Well, I see more and more women being entrepreneurs. And that's great, because China really wants more innovation. And I think that even though you don't necessarily see China female billionaires, you definitely see so many entrepreneurs everywhere. And one of the things that is making it much easier to be an entrepreneur for anybody, not just a woman, is the effectiveness of using your smartphone, your mobile phone, to order anything, to get anything fixed in 20 minutes, to set up a WeChat group and virtually manage your groups from around China. And so I think that the change in society around the smartphone has really enabled anybody to be an entrepreneur, and certainly that's benefited women.
Ray, you do a lot of work in the tech sector, and women in China play a big role in the tech sector. Some may say an outsized role. The Chinese government estimates 55% of internet firms were started by women. That's a remarkable number. Do women gravitate towards that sector, or do you see them represented in a big way in other sectors as well?
Oh, I definitely see a lot of women in the tech sector. That's increased over the past 10 years, but I'm actually not too informed on other sectors. One thing I did want to point out was that I think that, the government collecting such statistics is already very interesting, because I don't think such tabs were kept on the tech sector a few years ago. However, one thing to note about that statistic is it doesn't talk about, the amount of venture funding that female founders get. So while people are increasingly going into tech and starting their companies, I think there's still a big difference in who gets, outsized capital, especially venture capital. And the statistic I read was that only about 7% of female entrepreneurs are getting venture capital. A lot of them are self-funding their business. So, and what that really means is that, if you're self-funding your business, first of all, that's a lot of personal risk. Second of all, it's, much slower source of capital, and it could really limit the size that your company grows to. So while that, 55% is really encouraging, at the same time, I think it's important to look at the amount of actual dollars that is going to support these entrepreneurs from, banks and other institutions, such as larger funds.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.